The waitress handed the Mafia boss a stained napkin. It read, "C4 under your armchair." What could have led to this unexpected message? Why did a simple napkin carry such a powerful warning? Welcome, everyone, to our channel. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories. Thank you for being here with us and supporting the channel through every journey. We truly appreciate your time and company. Now we would love to hear from you. Comment where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Your continued support means so much to us, and we hope this story brings you an unforgettable experience. Now, let's begin today's story. The most dangerous man in Chicago was sitting 3 feet away from me, and I was the only person who knew something was wrong. I still remember the sound of crystal glasses touching polished tables, the soft music drifting through the restaurant, and the strange feeling that something invisible had entered the room before anyone noticed. My name is Clara Whitmore, and before that night, I was just another waitress trying to finish my shift, pay my rent, and save enough money to complete my nursing classes. I never expected my ordinary life to cross paths with Julian Voss, a man whose name made powerful people lower their voices. The restaurant was filled with wealthy guests wearing expensive watches and tailored suits, but Julian was different. He did not need to announce his importance. Everyone already knew. That evening, I was assigned to the VIP section, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and doing what I had done hundreds of times before. Keep smiling. Stay professional. Do not get involved. Those were the rules I lived by. But sometimes, life changes because of one small moment. One detail you almost ignore. One decision you make without knowing where it will lead. Julian sat beneath the warm glow of the restaurant lights, surrounded by people who watched his every move. He looked calm, almost untouchable, like someone who had spent years learning how to hide every emotion behind a quiet expression. But I noticed something that bothered me. Not about him. About the room around him. A movement. A pause. A detail that did not belong. I had always been observant. Maybe it came from working long hours in customer service. Maybe it came from growing up learning that small signs often mattered more than big words. A person's hands, their eyes, the way they looked around when they thought nobody was watching. Those little things told stories. I walked past Julian's table again, pretending to focus only on empty glasses and unfinished plates. My heart was beating faster, but I forced myself to stay calm. I did not know him. I did not know his world. I only knew that something felt wrong. And somehow, in that moment, I had to decide whether to ignore that feeling or trust it. Most people in that room saw Julian Voss as a powerful man, a person surrounded by influence, money, and protection. But I saw something else. I saw a man who had no idea that danger could be sitting closer than he expected. I looked down at the folded cloth in my hand and wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Because once I stepped into his world, there would be no pretending I had never noticed. There would be no going back to being invisible. I took a slow breath and walked toward his table. The lights reflected across the marble floor. The conversations continued around me. Nobody knew that a simple waitress was about to make a choice that would change everything. I was not trying to impress him. I was not looking for a reward. I was just doing what I believed was right. And that was the one thing Julian Voss never expected from anyone. Kindness without a price. Courage without a reason to gain something. A stranger choosing to help when walking away would have been easier. I placed the folded cloth beneath the edge of his coaster and stepped back quietly. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The world continued moving. The music played. The guests laughed. But then Julian looked down. And for the first time that night, the man everyone feared looked genuinely surprised. For a moment, I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Julian Voss did not move. He simply looked at the folded cloth beneath his coaster, his expression impossible to read. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade around me. The laughter, the quiet conversations, the sound of silverware against porcelain plates. Everything became distant. I stood near the next table, pretending to organize empty glasses while watching him from the corner of my eye. I had expected anger, confusion, maybe even suspicion. What I did not expect was silence. Julian slowly picked up the cloth and studied the words written across it. His eyes moved once, then again. He did not look around immediately. He did not call anyone over. He did not create a scene. That was when I realized something about him. A man like Julian Voss did not survive by reacting quickly. He survived by thinking first. I had heard his name before. Everyone in Chicago had. People talked about him in careful voices, never too loudly, never with unnecessary details. Some called him a businessman. Others called him something much darker. But standing there, watching him read a message from a waitress he had never met, I saw something different. I saw a man calculating every possibility before making his next move. Julian placed the cloth down slowly. His hand rested beside the coaster for only a second before he looked directly at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. That single glance made my entire body tense. It was not because he looked angry. It was because he looked like he was trying to understand me. I quickly turned away and picked up another empty glass from the nearby table. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. Why did I do it? That question kept repeating in my mind. I could have walked away. I could have told myself it was not my problem. People like Julian Voss lived in a world I knew nothing about. A world of influence, secrets, and people who never showed their true intentions. I was just Clara Whitmore, a waitress working a late shift in a restaurant where one dinner could cost more than my monthly grocery bill. I was not supposed to be part of his story. But sometimes, the moments we try hardest to avoid are the ones that define us. I noticed Julian's attention shift back toward the room. He looked calm, but something had changed. The relaxed confidence from before was gone. Now he was watching, listening, paying attention to details everyone else ignored. And somehow, I knew he believed me. Not completely, not yet, but enough to consider that my warning mattered. A few minutes passed. The restaurant continued as normal, but the atmosphere around Julian's table felt different. His guests continued their conversations, unaware of the silent exchange that had happened. I continued working, carrying plates and refilling glasses, trying to convince myself that everything was over. Then Julian stood up. The movement was simple, quiet, almost ordinary, but the entire room seemed to notice. People naturally made space for him. Employees stepped aside. Guests lowered their voices. He did not demand attention. Attention followed him. As he walked away from the table, his eyes met mine one more time. This time, there was a question behind them. A question I knew I would eventually have to answer. Who was I? Why had I warned him? And how had I noticed something that everyone around him missed? I looked down at my hands, still holding the empty tray, and wondered if I had just opened a door that could never be closed again. Because saving someone's life was one thing, but getting the attention of Julian Voss was something completely different. I thought the night would end when Julian Voss left the restaurant. I was wrong. Some moments do not disappear when people walk away. They follow you. They wait quietly in the back of your mind until you finally understand that something has changed. I finished my shift almost an hour later, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, and trying to convince myself that I had imagined the intensity in Julian's eyes. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe tomorrow would come, and everything would return to normal. But normal had already disappeared the moment I placed that folded cloth beneath his coaster. When I stepped outside into the cool Chicago night, the city felt different. The streets were familiar, the lights from the buildings reflected on the pavement, and the sound of passing cars filled the air. Yet I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching. Not in a frightening way. More like I had stepped into a story that had already started without me knowing the first page. I walked toward the train station, holding my worn handbag close, thinking about everything I had done. I had not expected anything in return. I did not want money. I did not want recognition. I just saw something wrong and acted. That was all. At least, that was what I told myself. The next morning, I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. I needed the routine. The familiar sounds of coffee machines, clean plates, and morning preparations helped me forget about the previous night. I tied my apron, checked the reservation list, and started preparing for another busy day. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. Then the manager approached me with a strange expression. "Clara, someone is asking for you." My first thought was that it was a customer complaint. Maybe someone had noticed I had been distracted. Maybe someone wanted to question what happened. But when I turned around, I saw two men standing near the entrance. They were dressed simply, but their confidence made it clear they were not ordinary visitors. One of them looked at me and politely asked if I was Clara Whitmore. My instincts immediately became alert. I answered carefully, yes. The man nodded and handed me a small envelope. No explanation, no dramatic words, just a simple gesture. I looked at the envelope in my hand, unsure whether I should open it. Everyone around me continued working, unaware that a quiet moment was unfolding in the middle of a normal morning. Inside was a handwritten note. Only a few words. Thank you for last night. Below it was a phone number. Nothing else. I stared at the message longer than I expected, because the person who wrote it was not just any customer. It was Julian Voss, the man who had built his entire life around never trusting anyone. The man who had every reason to believe that every action came with a hidden motive. Yet somehow, he had taken my warning seriously. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside my bag. I told myself I would forget about it. I told myself I would not call. But deep down, I already knew something had changed. Later that afternoon, while serving guests, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It was not unusual for a city like Chicago. People drove expensive cars every day. But there was something about it that made me pause. A few minutes later, my phone received a message from an unknown number. It was short. We need to talk. I looked at the screen, feeling the weight of those 4 words. I knew exactly who had sent it. And for the first time since that night, I realized the truth. I had not simply saved Julian Voss from a dangerous moment. I had caught the attention of a man who was used to controlling every situation. Now he wanted answers from the one person who had seen through his world without trying to enter it. I should have ignored the message. That was the first thought that crossed my mind when I saw those 4 words on my phone. We need to talk. Simple, direct, the kind of message that could mean anything. But coming from Julian Voss, it meant something different. A man like him did not waste time. He did not reach out unless there was a reason. I stood behind the counter of the restaurant, staring at the screen while the sounds of the busy afternoon moved around me. Plates were being placed on tables. Customers were laughing. The coffee machine was running. Everything looked normal. But inside, I knew my life had already moved into unfamiliar territory. I waited until my shift ended before I made a decision. I told myself I was only going to meet him because I wanted answers. I wanted to know why he had sent people to my workplace. I wanted to know why a man with endless resources cared about a waitress who had simply followed her instincts. That was all. At least, that was what I told myself. The address he sent led me to a quiet private office in downtown Chicago. It was not the kind of place that showed off wealth. There were no unnecessary decorations or obvious displays of power. Everything was clean, organized, and carefully chosen. The moment I stepped inside, I understood something. Julian Voss did not need to prove who he was. His presence already did that for him. A woman at the front desk greeted me politely and guided me toward a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Julian was standing near the glass, looking out at Chicago as if he was studying every street below. When he turned around, I noticed the same thing I had seen the night before. Calm. Control. A person who revealed nothing unless he wanted to. Clara Whitmore, he said. Hearing my name from him felt strange. Like my ordinary life had somehow become connected to a world I had never planned to enter. I nodded. Julian looked at me for a moment before speaking again. You saved me a great deal of trouble. I did not know how to respond. I did not feel like a hero. I had simply noticed something and acted. Anyone would have done the same. He almost smiled at that. No, they would not. That answer stayed with me, because I realized Julian Voss saw the world differently. To him, kindness was unusual. Trust was rare. A person helping without expecting something in return was almost impossible to understand. He asked me questions about that night. What I saw, when I noticed it, why I decided to warn him. I answered honestly. I told him I did not know who he was when I made that choice. I did not know his reputation. I did not know his influence. I only knew that someone might need help. For the first time, his expression changed slightly. Not much, just enough for me to notice. It was the smallest crack in the carefully controlled image everyone else saw. You are different, he said quietly. I looked at him and shook my head. No, I am just a waitress who pays attention. The room became silent for a moment. Then Julian looked away toward the city again. Maybe that was exactly why he was interested. Not because I had entered his world, but because I had seen it from the outside and still chose to do the right thing. Before I left, he stopped me with one final sentence. Clara, if you ever notice something like that again, do not handle it alone. I looked back at him. It sounded like advice, but somehow it also sounded like concern. And that was the part one did not understand. Because the most powerful man I had ever met was not asking me to fear his world. He was warning me that his world could change mine. I thought I understood people like Julian Voss. I thought powerful men were easy to recognize because they always surrounded themselves with the same things. Expensive clothes, private offices, people who followed their instructions without question. But after that conversation, I realized I had been looking at the wrong things. The most interesting part about Julian was not the image everyone else saw. It was the silence behind it. The questions he did not ask. The emotions he carefully hid. The way he listened when most people would have simply given orders. A few days passed after our meeting, and I tried to return to my normal routine. I went back to the restaurant. I served customers. I studied during breaks. I answered emails from my nursing program. I convinced myself that my life had not changed. But every time my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, I wondered if it was him. And every time a luxury car passed by the restaurant, I looked twice before reminding myself that I was being ridiculous. Julian Voss was part of a world I did not belong to. Then, one evening, everything changed again. It started with a simple request from my manager. Clara, could you take the VIP section tonight? I almost said no. The VIP section was always more stressful. The customers expected perfection. Every small mistake felt bigger under those bright lights. But I needed the extra hours, so I accepted. I adjusted my uniform, picked up my tray, and walked toward the private dining area. I immediately noticed the difference. The atmosphere was quieter, more controlled. The guests spoke in lower voices. The staff moved more carefully. And sitting at the center table was Julian Voss. For a second, I wondered if he had planned this. Then I noticed his expression. He looked just as surprised to see me. Clara, he said. My name again. Somehow, hearing him say it still felt unusual. Like he remembered a detail about me that should not have mattered. I placed the menus down and tried to act professional. I was a waitress. He was a customer. That was the boundary. At least, that was what I wanted to believe. During the evening, I noticed something different about Julian. He was not the cold person people described. He thanked employees. He listened carefully when someone spoke. He noticed small details that others ignored. It did not erase the mystery around him, but it made me question everything I thought I knew. Later, while I was clearing empty glasses from his table, he quietly stopped me. You always observe everything, do you not? The question caught me off guard. I smiled slightly. It helps when you work with people all day. Julian looked at the table for a moment before looking back at me. Most people see what they expect to see. You noticed what others missed. I did not know what to say, because the truth was, I had not expected him to remember that moment. I had not expected him to understand why it mattered. Before I walked away, Julian said something that stayed with me. You should be careful, Clara. People who notice things often become noticed themselves. His words followed me for the rest of the night. Because I finally understood something. I thought I had stepped into Julian Voss's world when I warned him. But maybe the opposite was true. Maybe that one small decision had caused him to step into mine. And I had no idea what would happen when a man who controlled everything started paying attention to someone who had nothing to offer except honesty. I never expected a simple conversation to become something I would think about every day. But Julian Voss had a way of making ordinary moments feel different. Not because he tried to impress people. In fact, he did the opposite. He spoke less than most people. He watched more than he talked. And somehow, that made every word he chose feel important. After that evening at the restaurant, I started noticing small changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that anyone else would have recognized. But I did. A quiet car waiting outside the restaurant after my shift. A familiar feeling that someone was making sure I got home safely. A simple message asking if I had eaten dinner after a long workday. It was strange. Julian was a man who seemed to have control over everything around him. Yet the way he interacted with me was surprisingly careful. He never demanded my attention. He never treated my kindness like something he owned. Instead, he seemed almost confused by it, like he was trying to understand why someone would help him without wanting anything in return. One afternoon, during my break, I sat in the small employee area behind the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I was reviewing my nursing notes when my coworker Sarah walked in and looked at me with curiosity. "Clara, are you hiding something?" I looked up and laughed. "What makes you think that?" She pointed toward my phone. "Because you have been staring at that screen for 5 minutes, and you have not read a single word on it." I quickly locked my phone and smiled. It was nothing. But it was not nothing. A message from Julian had arrived earlier that morning. He had asked if I could meet him for coffee. Not at his office. Not somewhere private or intimidating. Just a small cafe near the river where people came and went all day. I almost refused. Every sensible thought in my mind told me to keep distance. People like Julian Voss did not enter ordinary lives without changing them. But another part of me remembered something important. Behind the reputation, behind the rumors, there was a person who had looked genuinely surprised when someone cared about his safety. When I arrived at the cafe, Julian was already there. He sat near the window, dressed simply compared to the way I had seen him before. No formal setting. No room full of people waiting for his instructions. Just him. For the first time, he looked less like the powerful figure everyone feared and more like a man carrying a weight nobody else could see. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded and sat across from him. I expected questions about that night. Instead, he asked about me, my work, my classes, my plans for the future. It surprised me. Someone like Julian Voss could have found out anything about me in minutes. Yet he chose to ask me directly. "Why do you care?" I finally asked. He looked at his coffee for a moment before answering. "Because most people approach me because of what they think I can give them. You approached me because you thought I needed help." I did not know how to respond. His honesty caught me off guard. We sat there quietly for a moment, listening to the sounds of the city outside. For the first time, I saw a side of Julian that the world never saw. Not the businessman. Not the powerful man surrounded by influence. Just someone who had spent years believing trust was impossible. And maybe that was why he remembered me. Not because I had done something extraordinary, but because, in a world where everyone wanted something from him, I was the one person who expected nothing at all. As I left the cafe that day, I realized something had changed. I was no longer just the waitress who noticed something unusual. I had become someone Julian Voss wanted to understand. And I had a feeling that was only the beginning. I used to believe that people like Julian Voss lived in a completely different universe. A world where every door opened easily, every problem had a solution, and every person around them followed without hesitation. But the more time I spent near him, the more I realized something important. Power did not make someone less human. Sometimes, it simply made people hide their humanity better. After our coffee meeting, I tried to keep my distance. I returned to my normal schedule, balancing restaurant shifts with my nursing classes and the endless list of responsibilities that filled my days. But life had a strange way of bringing Julian back into my path. A few days later, I received another message from him. This time, it was not an invitation. It was a question. "Do you always notice things other people miss?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. It was such a simple question, but somehow it felt heavier than it should have. I thought about answering casually, but with Julian, pretending never seemed to work. So I replied honestly, "Maybe. I think people reveal more than they realize." His response came a few minutes later. "That is a rare quality." I smiled when I read it. Because for the first time, I wondered if Julian was not just trying to understand me. Maybe he was trying to understand something about himself. The following week, I was asked to work another private event at the restaurant. It was a charity dinner filled with business leaders, local organizations, and people who wanted to be seen supporting good causes. I had worked events like this before. I knew the routine. Carry the trays. Remember the orders. Stay invisible. But when I entered the ballroom, I saw Julian standing near the entrance. He was not surrounded by attention. He was not trying to dominate the room. He was simply observing everything quietly. When his eyes found mine, his expression changed slightly. Not a smile exactly. Something softer, like he was relieved to see a familiar face in a room full of strangers. During the event, I noticed how different he was from the person people described. He spoke respectfully to employees. He listened carefully during conversations. He noticed when someone felt uncomfortable and adjusted the situation without making a show of it. The world saw Julian Voss as someone untouchable, but I was beginning to see the person underneath. Later that evening, I found him standing alone near the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Chicago stretched across the horizon, reflecting against the glass behind him. "You look like you were thinking about something complicated," I said. He turned and looked at me. "You always say what you were thinking?" I laughed quietly. "Not always. Just when I think someone needs to hear it." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he asked me a question I did not expect. "Do you ever get tired of being the person who helps everyone else?" The question caught me off guard. I looked away toward the city. "Sometimes. But I think everyone gets tired sometimes. The difference is whether you still choose to care." Julian stayed quiet after that. I could tell my answer affected him more than he wanted to admit. Because caring was not something his world encouraged. Trust was a weakness. Kindness was often mistaken for vulnerability. Yet here he was, listening to a waitress explain something about humanity that powerful people had forgotten. Before I returned to work, Julian stopped me. "Clara," he said. I turned around. "Thank you. Not for that night. For reminding me that not everyone sees the world the way I do." I nodded and walked away, but his words stayed with me. Because I realized something too. Julian Voss was not interested in me because I had saved him. He was interested because I had shown him a different way to see people. And somewhere between a quiet coffee shop and a crowded restaurant, the distance between our two worlds had started to disappear. I thought I understood the difference between Julian Voss and the rest of the world. I thought the only thing separating him from everyone else was power. The ability to make decisions that affected thousands of people. The ability to walk into a room and change the entire atmosphere without saying a word. But I was starting to realize that was not the real difference. The real difference was that Julian had spent years building walls around himself, and somehow, without even trying, I had found a small opening. I did not know if that was a good thing. Some days, I wondered if I was getting too close to a world I did not understand. Other days, I wondered if Julian was the first person who actually saw me beyond my job, my responsibilities, and the simple life I lived. A few days after the charity event, I received an invitation from Julian. It was not to a formal dinner. It was not to one of those expensive places where people discussed business while pretending not to care about money. It was to a small community center on the west side of Chicago. I was confused when I arrived. I expected something connected to his business. Instead, I found children painting, families receiving support, and volunteers organizing supplies. Julian was already there, speaking with people who clearly respected him. But there was something different about seeing him in that environment. He was not performing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply helping. I watched him from a distance and realized that there were parts of Julian Voss that nobody talked about. Everyone knew the rumors. Everyone knew the reputation. But almost nobody knew the quiet moments. The ones where he showed up without expecting recognition. When he noticed me, he walked over. "I hope this is not too different from what you expected," he said. I smiled. Honestly, I did not know what to expect. That was the truth. Julian looked around the room. People think they understand someone after hearing a few stories about them. But stories are usually incomplete. I looked at him carefully. "Was that something you believed before?" I asked. His expression changed slightly. "Yes. I believed people were exactly what they showed me." "And what did you learn?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment. That I was wrong. Those words stayed with me. Because coming from Julian, they meant more than a simple statement. They meant someone who had spent years protecting himself was beginning to question the way he saw the world. Later that afternoon, we walked outside together. The streets were busy, people moving through their normal routines, completely unaware of who was walking beside me. For a moment, Julian looked less like a powerful figure and more like an ordinary person trying to understand his own choices. Then his phone rang. His expression changed immediately. Not fear, not panic, just focus. He answered quietly, listened for a few seconds, and ended the call. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, but I noticed something had shifted. There was a problem inside his organization. Someone he trusted had made decisions without his approval. I could see the disappointment on his face, even though he tried to hide it. That was the moment I understood something important about Julian. The hardest part of his life was not managing power. It was knowing who he could trust. "You look disappointed," I said. He looked at me. "Most people would expect me to be angry, but you are not." "No, I am disappointed because I expected better." That answer surprised me, because it showed me something I had not considered before. Julian Voss did not just want control. He wanted loyalty. He wanted honesty. He wanted people around him who saw him as more than his reputation. As we stood there in the middle of the city, I realized the man everyone feared had a weakness. Not money, not influence. Something much simpler. He wanted to believe that genuine people still existed. And somehow, a waitress who once handed him a folded cloth had become someone he trusted enough to show that side of himself. I thought I knew what trust looked like. I thought trust was built slowly, through years of friendship, shared experiences, and countless conversations. But with Julian Voss, everything seemed to happen differently. Our connection was built from a single moment. A choice I made without knowing who he was. A decision that showed him I was willing to help without asking for anything in return. But I was beginning to understand that trust was not the same as safety. And the closer I got to Julian's world, the more I realized those two things were not always connected. After the day at the community center, Julian became quieter than usual. Not distant from me, but distracted. I could see that something was weighing on him. He still answered my messages. He still asked how my classes were going. He still remembered small details about my life that most people forgot. But there was a change. A small hesitation before he spoke. A moment where his attention would drift away, as if he was trying to solve a problem he could not share. One evening, after my shift ended, I found him waiting outside the restaurant. He was standing near the sidewalk, looking at the city lights. For someone who always appeared in control, he looked unusually thoughtful. "You do that often," I said. He turned toward me. "Do what?" "Stand there like you are carrying the entire city on your shoulders." For a second, I thought he might ignore the comment. Instead, he smiled slightly. "You notice too much, Clara." I laughed. "That is what you keep telling me." Because it is true. We stood there quietly for a moment. The city moved around us. People walked by, cars passed, and nobody knew that the man standing beside me was someone whose decisions affected an entire world I barely understood. Then Julian said something I did not expect. "I need your opinion." I looked at him carefully. "My opinion?" "Yes." That surprised me more than anything else. Julian Voss had advisors, experts, and people who spent their lives studying problems before giving him answers. Why would he ask me? Because you see things differently. I did not have a perfect response. I was just honest. I think sometimes people with power forget what things look like from the outside. He looked at me quietly. "What do you mean?" I took a breath. When everyone around you agrees with you, it becomes easy to believe you are always right. But sometimes the person who knows the least about your world can see something everyone else ignores. Julian looked away toward the street. I could tell he was thinking about those words. Later that night, he told me about someone close to him who had disappointed him. Someone he had trusted for years. He did not give details. He did not need to. I could hear the disappointment in his voice. The problem was not that someone disagreed with him. The problem was that someone had stopped being honest. That was the thing Julian valued most. Honesty. A quality he found almost impossible to find. "You know what is strange?" he said. I asked him what. "The person who had the least reason to stay in my life is the person I trust the most." I felt my heart pause for a second, because I understood what he meant. I was not part of his world. I did not need anything from him. I was not trying to gain influence or prove myself. I was simply Clara, a waitress, a student, someone who saw a person before a reputation. Before I left, Julian said something that stayed with me. I spent years thinking trust was something people had to earn through power. But maybe it is earned through what they do when nobody is watching. I walked home that night thinking about those words. Because Julian Voss was changing. Slowly. Quietly. And the most surprising part was that I was beginning to change too. I had entered his world because I wanted to help him. But now I wondered if, without realizing it, He was helping me see a world beyond the limits I had always accepted. I used to think the hardest part of knowing someone was discovering their secrets. But with Julian Voss, I learned that the hardest part was understanding the things he never said, the pauses between his words, the moments when he looked away instead of answering, the emotions he tried to hide because he believed showing them made him weaker. After everything that happened, I started seeing Julian differently. Not as the powerful man everyone talked about, not as the person whose name carried so much weight across Chicago. I started seeing him as someone who had spent years protecting himself from disappointment. And maybe that was why the next conversation we had changed everything. It happened on a quiet evening after my shift. The restaurant was closing, and I was finishing the last few tasks before heading home. I was tired, my feet hurt, and my mind was already thinking about tomorrow's classes. Then I saw Julian standing near the entrance. He looked different that night. Less guarded, more serious. "Clara, can we talk?" I nodded and followed him to a quieter area outside the restaurant. The city sounds surrounded us, but for a moment it felt like everything had slowed down. Julian looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "There is something you should know about me." I immediately became cautious. Not because I was afraid of him, because I understood that whatever he was about to say mattered. He told me that the image people had of him was only one part of the truth. He explained that living with power meant people often saw what they wanted to see. Some people admired him. Some people feared him. Some people only saw what they could gain from knowing him. But very few people actually asked who he was beneath all of that. I listened quietly, because for the first time, Julian was not trying to control the conversation. He was simply being honest. I asked him one question. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked surprised, almost like he had not expected me to ask. Then he answered, "Because you are the only person who never looked at me like I was something to use." That sentence stayed with me, because I realized Julian was not used to being treated like an ordinary person. Everyone around him seemed to react to his position, his influence, his reputation. But I had met him before I understood any of those things. To me, he was simply the man sitting in that restaurant who received a warning from a stranger. The man who looked surprised when someone cared. Over the next few days, I noticed Julian becoming more open. Not completely. He was still Julian Voss. Still careful. Still someone who measured every situation before making a decision. But there were small changes. He asked for my advice instead of giving instructions. He listened instead of assuming. He admitted when he did not have all the answers. Those moments were small, but they mattered. Because change does not always happen through dramatic events. Sometimes it happens quietly, through conversations, through trust, through one person showing another that they do not have to remain the person they became just to survive. But then something happened that reminded me of the reality of Julian's world. One afternoon, while I was studying at a coffee shop near my apartment, I noticed a message from him. It was different from his usual texts. It was shorter, more serious. He asked if I was available to meet. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the look on his face. Something had changed. The calm confidence was still there, but underneath it was concern. "Clara," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." I waited, because I already knew this was not just another conversation. This was the moment when the distance between our worlds became impossible to ignore. I had learned about Julian's kindness. I had seen the person behind the reputation. But now I was about to learn that understanding someone's heart also meant understanding the challenges they carried. I knew from the moment I saw Julian's expression that whatever he needed to tell me would change the way I saw his world. There was a difference between understanding someone's struggles and becoming close enough to feel the weight of them. Until that moment, I had only seen pieces of Julian Voss, the thoughtful man who listened when I spoke, the person who quietly helped others without asking for recognition, the man who seemed almost surprised when someone treated him like a normal human being. But that evening, I saw the part of him that he usually kept hidden, the part that reminded me his life was not as simple as the quiet moments we shared. We sat across from each other in a small private room at a quiet cafe. Julian looked at the table for a moment before speaking. "There are people around me who are making decisions without honesty." I listened carefully. He did not sound angry. He sounded disappointed. And somehow, that felt more serious. I had learned that Julian was not someone who reacted without thinking. When something bothered him, it was usually because it challenged something deeper. Trust, loyalty, respect, the things he valued more than anything else. I asked him if he knew who he could trust. He gave a small smile, but there was no happiness behind it. That is the problem. I thought I did. His answer stayed with me, because I understood something about Julian that most people probably never noticed. He was not afraid of losing control. He was afraid of realizing that the people around him were not who he believed they were. For someone like Julian, trust was not just a feeling. It was the foundation of everything. Without it, even the most powerful person could feel completely alone. I told him something I had learned from my own life. Sometimes, people show you who they are through the small things. Not through promises. Not through words. Through actions when nobody is watching. Julian looked at me quietly. You really believe that? I nodded. I have to. Otherwise, how do you know who is real? For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled slightly. That is probably why you noticed me. I laughed softly. I noticed a problem. Not you. But I knew what he meant. He was not talking about the warning anymore. He was talking about the fact that I had seen something beyond the surface. Later that week, I noticed Julian becoming more careful about the people around him. Not colder, not more distant, just more aware. He started asking different questions, listening more closely, paying attention to things he might have ignored before. It was almost strange watching someone with so much influence realize that the smallest details often revealed the biggest truths. But then I received a message from him late one evening. It was not like his usual messages. It was brief. Clara, I need your help. I stared at those words for a long time. Because Julian Voss did not ask many people for help. He had resources, connections, people who could solve problems quickly. But he was asking me, the waitress who had once placed a simple warning beside his glass. I met him the next day at his office. The city stretched behind the windows, filled with people who had no idea what was happening inside. Julian stood there quietly, holding a document in his hand. I have been looking into something, he said. Something connected to the person I told you about. The one I trusted. I waited for him to continue. What he revealed was not a simple disagreement. It was a reminder that even the strongest people could be affected by the choices of those closest to them. Julian looked at me and said something I never expected to hear from him. I need someone who will tell me the truth, even when it is not what I want to hear. And in that moment, I understood why he had come to me. Not because I had answers, not because I knew his world, but because I was the one person who had never been afraid to see him as he really was. I used to think the hardest part of helping Julian was understanding the world around him. The rules, the expectations, the people who moved through his life with hidden intentions. But I was starting to realize something else. The hardest part was understanding the pressure he carried every single day. Julian Voss had built an image of someone who could handle anything. Someone who always knew the right decision. Someone who never doubted himself. But behind that image was a person who was tired of questioning everyone around him. After he asked for my help, I spent days thinking about what he had told me. I was not an expert. I did not know how to navigate his world. I was a waitress with a notebook full of nursing lessons and a schedule that barely gave me time to sleep. But maybe that was exactly why he trusted me. I had no reason to protect a reputation that was not mine. I had no reason to tell him what he wanted to hear. I only knew how to be honest. When I met Julian again, he brought me to a quiet office away from the busy parts of downtown Chicago. The room was simple, almost surprisingly so. There were no unnecessary decorations. No signs meant to impress visitors. Just a desk, a few chairs, and a large window overlooking the city. Julian placed several documents on the table. I looked at them carefully, but did not pretend to understand everything. What am I looking for? I asked. He looked at me and said something I did not expect. You are looking for what feels wrong. That answer made me pause, because it was the same instinct that had guided me that night in the restaurant. The same feeling that told me something did not belong. I studied the papers slowly. Dates, names, information that seemed normal at first. But then I noticed small inconsistencies, details that did not match, a pattern that seemed easy to overlook if someone was only looking at the bigger picture. I pointed to one section. Why does this part look different from the others? Julian leaned closer and studied the page. I do not know. That was the first time I heard him say those words. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he was willing to admit he did not have every answer. After that day, Julian started trusting his own instincts less and his observations more. He began asking different questions. He stopped assuming that people were loyal simply because they had been around for years. He started paying attention to actions instead of promises. And I noticed something else. He was not just learning from me. I was learning from him too. Before meeting Julian, I thought power meant never needing anyone. I thought being strong meant carrying every problem alone. But Julian showed me that even the strongest people needed someone who could remind them to slow down and look at things differently. One evening, we sat outside a small cafe after a long day. The city lights reflected across the street, and for once, Julian looked completely calm. "Do you regret helping me?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him. "Why would I?" "Because your life became more complicated after that night." I smiled slightly. "Maybe, but I think some things are worth being complicated." Julian looked at me for a moment, and I saw something I had rarely seen before. Appreciation without hesitation. Not the kind of gratitude people show because they feel obligated. Something deeper, something genuine. But just as things started to feel easier between us, I noticed a change. Julian became more protective, more careful about where I went and who knew about me. He tried to hide it, but I could tell something had happened. Something that made him realize I was no longer just a person who helped him once. I had become someone connected to him, someone he could not ignore. And that was when I understood the truth. The biggest change in Julian's life was not that he had found someone who could help him solve problems. It was that he had found someone he did not want to lose. I used to think that one small decision could only change one moment. I never imagined it could change two lives. When I walked into that restaurant months earlier, I was just Clara Whitmore, a waitress trying to balance long shifts, nursing classes, and a future I was still building. I never expected that a simple act of kindness would bring me closer to Julian Voss, a man who had spent his entire life keeping everyone at a distance. But looking back, I realized something important. The biggest changes in life rarely happen with a loud announcement. Sometimes they begin quietly. A choice, a conversation, a person deciding to see someone else as human when the rest of the world only sees a reputation. After everything we had been through, Julian was no longer just the powerful man people whispered about. He was the person who remembered how I took my coffee, the person who asked about my classes before discussing his own problems, the person who slowly learned that trust was not something to control. It was something to build. The situation around him eventually became clearer. The people he once trusted were no longer as reliable as he believed. But instead of becoming colder, Julian changed. He stopped letting disappointment define him. He started making choices based on the kind of person he wanted to become, not the person everyone expected him to be. That was the part of Julian I admired most. Not his influence, not his confidence, his ability to change. One evening, we returned to the same restaurant where everything had started. The place looked exactly the same. The same lights, the same tables, the same quiet music playing in the background. But everything felt different. I stood near the table where I had once placed that folded cloth, remembering how uncertain I had been. Julian looked around and smiled slightly. "You know," he said, "most people would have walked away that night." I shrugged. "Maybe." But I did not. He looked at me. "Why?" I thought about the question. The answer was simple. Because someone needed help. Julian nodded slowly. "For years, I thought people only acted when they wanted something. You proved me wrong." I smiled. "Maybe you just needed to meet someone who was not interested in what you had." He looked at me quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe I needed to meet someone who reminded me what mattered." Those words stayed with me, because they showed how far Julian had come. The man who once believed trust was a weakness had learned that trust was what made people stronger. The man who thought power could solve every problem had learned that some things could only be changed through understanding. And the woman who thought she was invisible had learned that even an ordinary person could make an extraordinary difference. Years later, when I thought about that night, I did not remember the fear of stepping into an unfamiliar world. I remembered the choice. I remembered the moment when I decided to help someone I did not know. I remembered that a person's value was never determined by their position, their wealth, or the life they were born into. It was determined by the choices they made when nobody was watching. Julian Voss had once ruled his world through control, but eventually, he discovered something more powerful: connection, compassion, and the courage to let someone truly know him. As for me, I never became someone different because of his world. I became more myself. The waitress who noticed small details. The woman who trusted her instincts. The person who learned that even the smallest kindness could reach someone who thought they needed nothing. And maybe that was the real lesson. Sometimes, the people who change our lives are not the ones with the most power. Sometimes, they are the ones brave enough to care when everyone else chooses to look away.